Last week, the Vorkath Zemouregal boss fight was released. This week, we see numerous bug fixes and tweaks to the fight after numerous player complaints. Not all complaints were addressed, but some. But more importantly than all of that, there are still many players who are having a very rough time with this fight, even in story mode. Good day, everybody. Many of you commented on my quest guide video for this fight that even the story mode with best in slot or close to best in slot gear and max levels was still really challenging. So in this guide, I'm going to cover everything for this fight from the bare basics of equipment and buffs and bonuses, all that, which apply to high level PVM in general, as well as Vorkath and Zemouregal specific fight mechanics, which, to be honest, are still in an undesirable state, as there are a lot of mechanics that you still just have to tank because they have very little warning. But all that considered, I will show you how to get not the fastest, not the slowest, but decent kills with little food usage that you can do over and over again while you learn this boss better and better. With all that said, this is a fairly lengthy guide, so it is timestamped. Please jump around to whatever parts of this guide interest you the most. A quick note on my setup and testing here. I ran almost all my kills with a semi-manual Necromancy setup that I'm comfortable with, exclusively with tier 90 tank gear that you can make, so it's very accessible. I don't recommend doing this boss with gear or levels any lower than that anyways. I also ran one kill with a bit stripped down gear, namely that I removed my Zook cape, and yes, it is pronounced Zook, by the way. I have gotten so many comments on that, we're going to address this here and now and ask him himself. Hey man, how do you pronounce your name? Zook or Zuck?
I am Zook.
Great, thanks man. Now that's cleared up, I think no one will ever comment on that ever again. Anyways, what you've been watching here is my full Revo setup, actually not my preferred semi-manual setup. Here I did remove the Zook cape, and I also removed the Command Army ability since not everybody has 99 Necromancy and 35,000 souls yet. The rest of my gear is largely the same in both setups. The Revolution bar is very different, and I'll touch on that, but when I actually explain the kill and the mechanics, I will use my semi-manual build, because with a Necromancy setup especially, it's really important to touch on manually firing off things like Finger of Death and Volley of Souls, etc. Unlike my attempts at race, y'all, I am happy to report that a full Revo, absolutely full Revo Vorkath and the Minion phase before is possible. It just makes a long fight even longer, but if you're really not into any kind of manual combat yet, and you want to learn Vorkath's mechanics before you give that a shot, it does work. I got an 8-minute and 40-something second kill, just for reference, so expect long kills, but it's doable while you're learning. Okay, let's get into gear. I am using exclusively tier 90 tank Necromancy armor and the tier 90 weapons that are craftable. This is both for survivability and because this armor is very accessible once you have the required level of Necromancy. As I mentioned before, I don't recommend doing it with any lower tier of armor or levels because this is already a long fight as it is. The next most important piece of gear here is the Salve Amulet E. This gives a huge accuracy and damage boost against undead. And now, the undead minions, including the undead giant before the fight at the places of power, are affected by the Salve Amulet E. It was a bug on release that has since been fixed, and I will say it has made this part go much, much smoother than before. Of course, the amulet also works against Vorkath, and now that I think about it, it probably doesn't work on Zemouregal because he's just a Majorat, not an undead. I don't know, but either way, it's worth wearing just that and not even bring another switch if you don't feel like it, because for most of the fight, it will up your damage a ton. I am also wearing the Zook cape here for the Death Skulls buff. It is a big one. If you don't have this cape yet, try to get it, but otherwise, wear your next best cape that has good Necromancy bonuses. For the pocket slot, I am using a Scripture of Jazz. This is because with Necromancy in particular, you can stack up a lot of damage with the Scripture of Jazz. If you're not familiar with how it works, basically it has a chance to trigger this time warp effect, which is actually weird to explain, but basically for 10 seconds after triggering, it keeps track of how much damage you've dealt, and then it deals another 20% of that back. So with Necromancy, it's easy to get an extra damage hit of over 10,000 or 13,000 with this. If you're really struggling in the Minion phase, another option I would only suggest is the Scripture of When, if you can group the minions close together, because that will AoE a lot of them and do a lot of damage that way. My aura of choice is the Vampirism aura. I've tried this with Penance just for convenience, and it is a lot less survivable of a fight, even for me, if you go down that route. So, I suggest Vampirism because it will heal you a good chunk for every bit of damage you do, and it makes this fight that much easier to survive without eating. My ring slot is nothing fancy, it's a Luck of the Dwarves, just whatever the best ring you have. And in my ammo pouch, I have a Nexus, Necromantic Nexus. It stores all your runes and ectoplasm. Not necessary, it'll save you some inventory space. If you don't have one yet, not the end of the world. You might see my inventory is loaded up with brews and restores. I don't need all of them. In fact, I hardly use any brews with this setup. I mainly just load up my inventory so I can do a bunch of kills back to back. But for normal mode with this setup, you won't need that much food or supplies. So if you don't have the focus yet, just have the runes and ectoplasm in your inventory. It's not a big deal. And transitioning very smoothly to our inventory setup, I kept it very simple for beginners. I have an enhanced Excalibur just for healing on the fly if I need some supplementary healing, a overload, very recommended if you're going to use brews because brews lower your stats and overloads readjust your stats every 15 seconds or so they keep your stats boosted, and a few super restores which are just there for prayer renewal. If you don't have access to overloads, then use your best Necromancy potion, a Supreme or an Extreme or whatever. And in that case, do not use brews. Use preferably blue blubber jellyfish or whatever food you have. Jellyfish, if you don't know, you can eat and restore a bit of health, but they don't reduce your adrenaline. Every other type of solid food does reduce your adrenaline, which is very harmful to how fast you can kill Vorkath, which is very harmful to you because you'll take more damage. Next, let's talk ability bars. Let me go over briefly my full Revo bar just so that you have it. It's out there. If you want to try it, go for it. And then I'll go into much more detail on my preferred semi-manual bar. Let me also state now that this is probably far from ideal even for a full Revo setup. And it does look a little strange compared to a Revo bar that you would use for other bosses because I put 2 adrenaline-consuming defensive abilities on there. And this is very Vorkath specific because even after the tweaks and fixes this week, a lot of mechanics in this fight are still not telegraphed properly or have a very short warning before you can prepare yourself for them. A good strategy for this fight in general is to cycle defensive abilities, namely Reflect and Debilitate. Both of these have the damage that you take for a short time. You can also use Devotion if you are praying Deflect Necromancy, which I do in this setup, which I do recommend, but not on the Revo bar because it's only useful, in my opinion, when Vorkath is gone and you're just finishing off Zemouregal. The idea with full Revo Necromancy is that it kind of sucks, actually. You get about half the DPS last time I checked of a more manual setup. The problem with full Revo Necromancy is that there isn't really a way to put some of the strongest abilities on there, like Finger of Death or Bloat, on your bar because they don't have a cooldown, but they do consume adrenaline. So there's not really a way to keep your adrenaline high for better abilities while having abilities like those on your Revo bar. So the only ability on the Revo bar here, besides the defensives that consumes adrenaline, is the Spectral Scythe, and I put that towards the end. This is a low adrenaline cost ability that you can trigger towards the end of your bar every now and then that will still deal a good bit of damage if you are not willing to manually fire off Finger of Death or Bloats. If you are willing to do that and hotkey at least those abilities, as is in my next setup that I'll go over, then you can remove Spectral Scythe here and just rely on manually firing off those much stronger abilities. Otherwise, the strategy is to keep your summons up, keep the Ghost command up, and fire off the Skeletons command as often as possible for the most damage. If you do have Command Army, Conjure Army, whatever it's called, you can put that there, and you'll also get a bonus little zombie in there at no extra expense. If you do not have Conjure Army, I don't recommend having the zombie on there because it's just one more ability that consumes time in your attack rotation, and honestly, the damage output from the zombie is not that worth it if you have to separately cast it. Now, regardless of whether you're going full Revo or semi-manual or full manual, there are at least 2 incantations that you should please cast and use. One you can use before all the fighting, and it is Darkness. This will give you an extra 20% chance to dodge everything. If you are using full tank tier 90 Necromancy armor, you'll also have an extra 10% chance to dodge incoming attacks for a total of 30% chance to just completely dodge incoming damage. On top of the Death Warden's damage reduction boost and HP boost, which are huge compared to the other combat styles, it helps a lot for just surviving. The second incantation I recommend having on hand, I recommend using at Vorkath, Zemouregal separately, and at each of the 3 undead giants. This is Invoke Death. Invoke Death applies a death mark on your next attack and makes it so that your target will be auto-executed when their HP reaches below 20% or 30,000 HP, whichever is lower. For Vorkath and Zemouregal separately, this means that you don't have to deal the last 30,000 HP to either of them. They will just be insta-executed. At the Undead Giants, it saves you a good bit of damage there too, since they have a high HP, about 120,000 in normal mode. Now let's go on to my semi-manual and preferred rotation, which you're watching now. I have removed Volley of Souls from my Revolution bar, and I am manually firing that off only when I have 3 dots on my soul meter there. If you have the Soulbound Lantern from Racial, you can wait until you have 5 for it to be totally optimal. I am also manually firing off Finger of Death when I have at least 6 Necrosis stacks, and I am using Bloat after my Death Skull's Living Death rotation, when I have a spare 20% adrenaline. In fact, it's most effective to use this in between your Living Death and Death Skulls rotation because you have time for about 2 abilities before you casually rebuild your adrenaline for another Death Skulls. But to be honest, at this point, I just fire off these abilities manually whenever I remember them and whenever the moment seems opportune for them. So don't worry if you're not tick perfect with your manual ability firing. Even if you just fire them off whenever you remember to, as you're keeping track of everything else going on, it's still better than not firing them off at all until you get more comfortable. Now, for those who are very new to Necromancy or rotations like this, who are maybe confused by the Death Skulls Living Death rotation that I mentioned, a lot of players know this. You can skip this part if you do, but if you don't, the idea is that you go into a fight with Death Skulls, ideally actually only with the Zook cape for this method. Once Death Skulls is off, you rebuild your adrenaline back to 100% and you use Living Death. This resets the cooldown of your Death Skulls and makes the cooldown 12 seconds while Living Death is up so that you can pop off a few more Death Skulls. Living Death is up for 30 seconds after you cast it, so this is a great way to dump a ton of damage in a short time. Most players, well not most, many players prefer to manually cast Living Death and Death Skulls so that the timing is appropriate. I just put it on my Revo bar because even for the undead giants and the minions outside, I still want the most DPS possible at any given time to clear them out. A lot of people were upset about this here because it kind of messes up your rotation once you get into the Vorkath fight because you just dumped everything on the undead giants and the minions outside, but whether you're just clearing out the one place of power to get straight to the fight or all 3 places of power to disable 2 of Zemouregal's mechanics, your rotation's kind of screwed either way, so you're not going to go into the Vorkath and Zemouregal fight with your full adrenaline and everything off cooldown anyways. Speaking of, now is a good time to mention that this guide does involve clearing out all 3 places of power to disable Zemouregal's minion summoning and spikes mechanics. This does drag out the fight quite a bit, or it drags out each kill time quite a bit, but I found that for a beginner, dealing with the spikes and minions on top of the existing mechanics is just a bit rough. So for starters, we're going to clear out all the places of power and then deal with limited mechanics during the actual boss fight. We're going to get into the boss fight in just a second, but I've only glossed over the minion phase here, so let's get a bit more into that. The idea is to kill the 3 undead giants at each place of power one at a time, and then disable each place of power one at a time by clicking on it. You know this from story mode already once you've done the quest. I recommend Soul Split here if you have it. If you don't, just deflect melee because the giants hit the hardest out of all the mobs, and then maybe switch your deflect prayers accordingly after the giants are dead to whoever's hitting you hardest. To be honest, Soul Split and the Sorrow Curse, that boosts Necromancy equivalently to Piety and all that, is highly, highly recommended. I don't know what this fight would look like without those, but it should also be fine considering the Ghost and your dodge chance and damage reduction with your Necromancy tank armor. Anyways, deal with the undead giants as quickly as you can. I recommend dumping all your best abilities. Don't worry about saving any adrenaline or cooldown abilities for Vorkath. If you half-ass this minion phase, you will go through too much food anyways because you'll get hit hard. Now, after the undead giant at each place of power is down, disrupt the place of power, and then I recommend taking the extra few seconds to clear out the rest of the minions. This is because the minions will follow you all the way to the edge of the map until you go into the final Vorkath fight, and the damage that they all collectively do can really pile up if you leave them alone. So just take a bit and clear out the remaining minions at each place of power. If you want to go a bit manual with it, you can pre-cast Conjure Army and pre-command the Ghost to save time before you actually enter a fight. And then, of course, remember to use your Finger of Death and Volley of Souls and Bloat as appropriate. A third incantation I would recommend for this Minions phase is Threads of Fate, if you're willing to use that or just have that handy somewhere. It can only be used once every 45 seconds, but it makes it so that briefly all of your single target attacks will hit enemies in a 4x4 radius of your target. So if you can clump together various enemies while you're hitting the giant, you can clear out a lot of their HP quite easily. Especially if you care to stack 12 Necrosis stacks for 2 Adrenaline less Fingers of Death, or wait until your Volley of Souls is full, etc. It's certainly not a requirement to get through and survive this phase, I just did it here and there to save a bit of time. That's about it for the Minions phase. Now, before you disrupt the 3rd place of power, whether you go there first or last, make sure you're ready for a fight, because as soon as you disrupt it, you'll be teleported into the Vorkath and Zemouregal arena. Now, as for this fight, in normal mode, Vorkath has 750,000 HP, Zemouregal has 250,000. Zemouregal takes extremely reduced damage until Vorkath is down and flies away. And to avoid confusion, I mean that Vorkath never actually dies. When he hits 0 HP, he just flies away permanently, but he has a few other mechanics where he also flies away and comes back, so that's what I mean. I have 2 strong suggestions for the beginning of this fight. 1, turn on Deflect Necromancy. This is because Zemouregal has spontaneous abilities that hit you very hard. The damage from Vorkath is magic based, but not that hard typically. Suggestion number 2 is to get within melee range of Vorkath, even if you are using Necromancy. I have no idea if this is a bug or intended, but Vorkath has a very strong Fire Breath attack that hits you for up to half of your HP with magic damage. However, it completely misses you if you are within melee range. You know you're within melee range if you are sitting like past his head at his neck area. Again, I have no idea if this is intended, but I noticed that the attack completely misses you, so that's one mechanic you have to worry about 0%. Suggestion number 3 is tank the rest of the fight for the most part. There are very few mechanics after this that you have to worry about. Number 1 mechanic that you kind of have to worry about a little bit is when Vorkath flies up briefly and shoots down ice into the arena, which radially expands or squarely expands. I don't know the best way to describe that. Anyways, the intended way to dodge this weird mechanic is to step into the areas where the ice is not yet present, but it's a little bit weird. Also, the reason I don't recommend summoning familiars for this beginner setup is that this damage does a lot to your summoning familiars unless you dodge it yourself. But the good news is that this setup allows you to tank the first hit of that when you're in melee distance, and you will only take one hit of that because the rest goes radially outwards. The only thing you can do if you feel like it to prevent it is that when Vorkath flies up, you can use Anticipate or Freedom because this attack also stuns you. So if you're too late and you get stunned, you can just trigger Freedom. If you anticipate it beforehand, well, you can use Anticipate and avoid the stun. I recommend not even worrying about moving for this mechanic. Just sit there, take one hit, and then stay within melee distance of Vorkath to avoid future ice breaths. Mechanic number 2 and or 3 that you have to worry about is the acid pools that Vorkath spits up. If you kill him as fast as I do, you'll see this mechanic happen 1 time, maybe 2. This is where Vorkath spits up purple or green acid pools all over the arena. They may or may not land on you, and they do heavy damage very rapidly if they do land on you. So when you see Vorkath spitting up acid, after it lands, pay attention to where the pools are. It is kind of hard to tell if you're stepping on them. The best way to tell if you're stepping on a pool is if you're taking a crap load of damage suddenly, so just step away. Do your best to stay within melee distance. You can use dive if you need to. This is a fairly janky mechanic that a lot of players complained about because it damages you very quickly without any warning as to where the pools will land. Don't know if it'll be fixed later, hopefully, but for now, that's the best way to deal with it. The final real mechanic that Vorkath has is where he will fly away for a longer time, and this is where you use your extra action button. And I apologize, on this tiny laptop screen, my extra action button is hidden behind a whole bunch of buffs, but as soon as Vorkath flies away more permanently, hit that. This will prevent Vorkath from swooping down and engulfing the entire arena in ice and hitting you very hard. And instead, a ballista will fire at Vorkath, dealing 10,000 damage to him instead and knocking his ass down. Please do not use your extra action button at any other time. It does have a cooldown, and if it's cooling down while Vorkath flies away for this, it'll be pretty terrible for you. Now, when Vorkath flies away here, it does take a while for him to come back, and it is one time that Zemouregal is vulnerable, and he does not take reduced damage. So you can feel free to just attack Zemouregal here until Vorkath lands again. Or I should say, when he crashes down again like a sad heaping mess because you hit him with a ballista. After that happens, continue focusing on Vorkath until he is gone. Then you can focus Zemouregal. This is a good time to use Deflect Necromancy if you are taking a lot of damage for some reason, because your only damage source will be Zemouregal. And sorry, I didn't mean Deflect Necromancy, I meant Devotion while Deflect Necromancy is up. That way you'll take no damage from him. Make sure to apply a death mark to Zemouregal again if you forgot before, and just DPS him until he's gone. And that's it. And that's how you do normal mode Vorkath. By the way, if you've yet to get your first kill after Zemouregal is down, you have to wait for Sophia, your guard captain here, to run out. You can right-click her to claim your loot, and then you have to click her again and teleport out in order to open your loot. Alright, that's the guide. That's the whole thing. A little lengthy, like I said, but as I also said, I covered this from bare bones if you are fairly new to Necromancy combat, or combat and gearing and abilities and auras and all that to RuneScape 3 in general. Whether you're looking for all of Vorkath's unique rare drops or just 100 kills for Zemouregal's Nexus, I hope this guide helped you, and I hope it helps you learn Vorkath better and better so that you can get kills much smoother than what's shown in this guide. I'll try to do the same myself, and maybe at some point have a hard mode guide or a more streamlined normal mode guide. Maybe with other combat styles, but I doubt it until the combat beta becomes not a beta. I tried it with melee, it went really badly. Anyways, if you have any suggestions, if I missed anything, please shout it out in the comments. I don't mind at all, it'll help all other players. If you enjoyed this guide and you would like to see more content like this that is helpful, please consider liking this video and giving me a subscribe. Thank you if you've made it this far all the way through. I really appreciate it, and I'll catch you in the next one. Good luck.